Today we're going to be talking about single subject design, which is an extension of some of the quasi-experimental designs that we've talked about before in class, but are applied to an individual unit of observation, a single subject, as opposed to at a group level where there are multiple individuals where the patterns are averaged across those individuals. Here instead, we're focusing on one unit of observation, one individual, one client, one family, one classroom, one school, one community. The unit can vary, but we're focused just on one unit over time. The idea here with single subject design is that we are using a repeated measurement of the dependent variable. If you have a dependent variable, something like depressive symptoms, part of the function of single subject designs will be to utilize multiple observations, often at regular intervals, in order to assess what patterns are at a baseline phase, which we're calling here A, or at a treatment phase once some intervention has been introduced, which we refer to as B. And typically, how we illustrate these patterns in the different A and B phases, baseline and treatment, are through visual graphing exercises so that we're able to see how the measurements of the dependent variable, in this case, depressive symptoms, varies over time. So again, a core feature of single subject design is to include this repeated measurement of the dependent variable. Ideally, you would have measures of this target measure, so let's say depressive symptoms, with the client before implementing some new intervention, and then continue measuring those depressive symptoms with the same scale during the course of the intervention. So a pharmacological intervention like antidepressant medication, perhaps you're evaluating someone's depressive symptoms, a client's depressive symptoms, prior to suggesting an initiation of pharmacological antidepressive treatment. And then once that additional treatment has happened, which here is the intervention, we could continue to evaluate someone's depressive symptoms and see how that may change over time. As is often the case in practice, you may not actually have that exact measurement at the regular intervals that you would want in advance of that intervention. It can be that you could construct that from retrospective data or to approximate this idea of a baseline as needed. So this baseline phase really is meant to assess the period of time before the intervention where we can evaluate how someone's depressive symptoms operate in the absence of any intervention. So left to no intervention, what's going on for that particular client in terms of their depressive symptoms, and why this baseline phase is useful and how it gets implemented in a single subject design is essentially as an approximation of the control group that you would have in a randomized experiment. In other words, we're using this baseline phase as an approximation of this idea of a counterfactual, or the what would have happened had there been no intervention, which is in the future at this point still to come. So we can use this baseline phase as a measure of what would often be happening without some kind of intervention, and use that to compare to this intervention that is, again, still to come. So this baseline phase can demonstrate a few different visual depictions. Often what you want in terms of the patterns that are emerging is to have some stable kind of line or process. There may be a little variability, but in general, what you're seeing is a pretty stable pattern across time. That would suggest that someone is sort of in a steady state, if you will, with respect to their depressive symptoms. Some of the other common patterns that can emerge include a pretty wide range of variability, which is in the visual here in the top right quadrant. In the middle quadrants, you could see if someone were already increasing. So in the case of depressive symptoms, that they are increasing in their depressive symptoms and a pretty linear trend, or on the right side of this middle section with sort of an exponential growth. In the bottom, there are depictions of pretty cyclical patterns and ideas, which are more common under different sets of the outcome variable, but you could imagine maybe there. And then this last piece is that there's really no pattern at all, that there's a fair amount of variability. Sometimes it's quite high, sometimes it's quite low, and that it's really difficult to determine some kind of pattern. The patterns during these baseline measurements, because this baseline process is really meant to reflect what would have happened, we want to account for any of these trends that we see. So the steady state would be suggesting that without any intervention or treatment, that essentially someone's pattern was consistent over time. If there is some trend, like a linear increase or some kind of cyclical process, we'll have to take that into account once we evaluate the intervention, because we wouldn't want to attribute all of the effect or the benefit, so to speak, of the intervention to a pattern that was happening before the intervention happened. So considering what the pattern is for this baseline process is really important and helps to create a sense of internal validity. That is to say, the ability to confidently assess and take the results of a given study of the single subject design kind of model. Once we're in this treatment phase, then we're calling this B in contrast to the baseline phase of A. So this is the time period where the intervention is implemented and the repeated measurements on the dependent variable, in this case depressive symptoms, continue being evaluated with that same frequency. And then we're using that treatment phase data to compare that to the baseline phase, again, comparing to the theoretically what would have happened without this intervention. And again, we have this idea of graphing. So we want to see that visual depiction of what the pattern looked like during the baseline phase and what the pattern looks like during the intervention phase, and use that visual depiction as a way to articulate whether there has been progress, the size of progress, etc. There's a number of decision points in terms of what to measure for some kind of intervention with single subject design. First, there's what to measure. So that is essentially a question of the dependent variable of interest. That may be a function of discussions that you have with a client, where you co-create what the most meaningful outcomes will be of a given intervention. It may or may not be the thing that is necessarily clinically relevant. It may be something that you want to center on what the patient thinks is the most important outcome. So, for instance, side effects of a given treatment, if there's concern that side effects may be so severe that they will want to withdraw from that treatment, you may be wanting to monitor things like side effects rather than just the depressive symptoms themselves. So, what to measure becomes a really important piece to decide in advance. Then that will inform how to measure. So, how to measure, you may be thinking about frequency, which is often the number of counts of specific events. So, if there were the number of panic attacks in 1 week, that would be a frequency measure. The duration of that panic attack could also be what you wanted to measure. The interval between panic attacks may also be of important and use. And then the magnitude or the severity of the panic attack is also something that you might want to consider as a reflection of that dependent variable. And then who should measure how this data gets collected, whether that's self-reported from the participant or the client, whether that's done on an ongoing daily basis, whether that's weekly, and how that measurement should happen will be useful to consider as well. Then analyzing the single subject design, we have a few different patterns and processes that we want to go through by evaluating these visuals and using that visual as a way to analyze the data, how to interpret those visual patterns by measuring clinical significance, and then anticipating some of the problems of interpretation, things like the baseline improvement that we talked about before, or delayed change that can often happen where there's a lag in the intervention effect. So, in terms of the visual analysis, we are thinking often of one of these three sort of characterizations of what the visual change may be. So, in level, we may think that there's a big jump that's clear and exhibited. How much has the baseline level changed? If there's trend, there may be an increasing trend during the baseline, so someone's depression is getting worse. It could be that the trend reverses under the intervention, so that the trend actually is then going back down in a linear fashion. So it could be that the level jumps, it could be that the trend changes, and then the last piece is this sense of variability. So if there's a fair amount of variation between measurements in someone's depressive symptoms, the intervention may be shrinking that amount of variability. So, on a scale from, let's say, 0 to 10, where 10 depressive symptoms is the most, and in some weeks the client was having 8, and then 2, and then 8 again, and then 6, and then 4, and then 8, and then 2, that the variability may shrink so that the range is really just between 4 and 6 under the intervention. So during this baseline phase, there was a lot of variability between 8 and 2 and in between. And under the intervention, that variability may have narrowed so that you're just within a 2-unit window. And that may be something that you really want to evaluate. Again, this is all very dependent on what the outcome measure is that you are trying to consider. In terms of interpreting these patterns, we want to think about clinical significance. So particularly if the level has changed, by how much, and establishing in advance based on the clinical import of how much of a change is a meaningful change, that's how you can evaluate the impact of an intervention. One way to do that is to set criteria in advance. So you may have cutoff scores or setting the criteria that happens in advance of determining if you had on that scale from 0 to 10 depressive symptoms, if there had been a jump or a decrease by at least 2 symptoms, that was considered being clinically relevant. Those sorts of decisions are useful to consider in advance. So that you know what size of a difference you're really looking for. And then lastly, this cost-benefit analysis will be important to evaluate what kind of cost, that could be financial cost, time, etc., a really inclusive measure of cost, was required in order to get that 2 symptom decrease, and is that amount of investment worth that amount of decrease? So considering the cost-benefit analysis as a way to interpret the visual of what you're seeing. There's a number of things to consider when we're interpreting these the visuals in particular. One is where there's discrepant scores. So we talked about the baseline scores varying really widely. It's really hard to tell that there's a significant pattern. So say, for instance, in that case where we had a range between 2 and 8, if someone was staying high during that intervention phase with still a significant number of depressive symptoms, or for that matter, they decreased back down toward 2, because of that high variability during the baseline, we don't really know conclusively whether we have someone who's just within the normal range during this intervention period, or if there has actually been a meaningful decrease. Another issue is delayed change. So when the changes in the intervention phase actually take a while to materialize. So pharmacological treatment may be one case where we expect the effect on depressive symptoms, so to speak, to kick in at about 4 to 6 weeks after initiation and constant use of the antidepressive medication. So thinking about when you expect to see that change in the visual and the intervention side becomes really important. And then lastly, this notion of improvement in the baseline. So often when people call a new therapist to initiate treatment, that in and of itself really helps someone begin to think about how to adapt their mental health. Or you can think about other analogies and different kinds of situations, like calling a nutritionist may make you more likely to be monitoring your diet in a way that then there's increases in your nutrition, or increases or decreases in your depressive symptoms, because you're more mindful of your behavior or your mood. And that change, and particularly the increase in baseline, becomes something that's really important to consider when we're thinking about what the trend is within the intervention period, and is it just an extension of an improvement that was already happening during that baseline phase. In other words, if we hadn't had the intervention, would somebody have just kept going at the same rate and continued to get better? We don't want to misinterpret the effect of the intervention as absorbing something that would have happened without the intervention altogether. So considering this improvement at baseline becomes really useful. There's a number of different types of single subject designs that we'll go through to varying degrees of complexity, starting with this basic design of baseline and intervention. And then there are other ways where we can add additional complexity to improve the internal validity of the study, and also to achieve other kinds of aims with respect to different research questions. So the basic design of a single subject design is just this A-B design. So you have a baseline period and an intervention period. The pro for this kind of approach is essentially its simplicity. It can be used for any number of purposes: research, monitoring, and evaluation. The con is that it really doesn't address that sense of history. So whether someone was increasing or improving during the baseline period, regardless. And so it's really hard to know during that baseline period, is that actually a reflection of the sense of what would have happened without the intervention? Or was that baseline period already sort of unique? And only having the A and the B period to compare makes that really difficult to determine. Here are some visual depictions of these ideas of level change and trend change with an A, B baseline and intervention period sort of model. So the dependent variable here is anxiety, that's measured at each class. In the A section, there was the baseline. In the top part, you can see that the anxiety started really high and started to decrease a little bit, but then in the intervention period under B, that both the level dropped and the trend may have also changed. That trend change is more explicit and obvious in the bottom row, where anxiety was increasing linearly during the baseline phase, and then the intervention happened, which had a little spike in the anxiety symptom, but ultimately the trend took that back down to at least the point where it was at class 1, and potentially a little further lower. Withdrawal designs are one of the extensions of this classic A-B design, where essentially the withdrawal is then we add another A section back in. So we have a baseline, an intervention, and then we have this thing called the withdrawal, which is meant to be a reflection of what would have happened, or what would happen when the intervention is removed, and how does that help us to understand and really characterize what was going on in that baseline period in the first place. So the intervention concludes, and then you have anticipated and planned this follow-up period in order to identify how the intervention was effective with respect to ruling out potential interpretation issues, like that increase that may have been happening during the baseline period in the first place. Again, here's some visuals of this kind of ABA model, where the top is a reflection of the percentage of resistance to care. So during baseline, there's this wide variety of responses in terms of the resistance to care. During an intervention, and this is with people with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment, that during the intervention, the percent of respondents who are resistant to care has decreased considerably. And then in this withdrawal period, we see that starting to go back up. And so that withdrawal period helps us to understand how much the baseline period was potentially a bunch of noise, and to by how much the intervention was really adding value. You can see in the bottom panel that the participation percentages was a different way that the authors here considered this work, where they had at baseline the number of people who were participating. Then during the intervention, the participation was increasing. And then in the withdrawal period, the participation stayed high, but then started to decrease a bit over time. So again, the idea with this withdrawal period is to offer additional reflection of what would happen without the intervention. So again, another visual of what this might look like, where in the top, the middle, and the bottom rows, you can see the extent of the baseline time period moving from 4 to 8 to 12 sessions or days. And what that means is then you have more time in the intervention for client A, an even distribution for client B, and then shorter for client C. And inversely or conversely, you have shorter baselines for A, longer for B, and the longest is for C. And that helps to understand what that steady state may look like with seeing client C's baseline for so long. And also then we have the ability to see what for client A, the intervention looked like over a longer period of time. And those really help us to understand the extent to which the shorter baselines or the shorter interventions were really whether they were sort of flukes or whether they were representative or reflective of what would have been happening for other patients at that time. There are also multiple treatment designs where, similar to the ABA model, you could then extend that withdrawal period and follow it by an additional treatment or intervention period. That may be a place where you change the intensity. So, for instance, you may add to that intervention. It may also be that you create an alternative design or an alternative treatment. So you may try 2 different treatments in the 2 different B periods. So visually, this is a depiction of ABAB. So you had A as the initial baseline period, B as the initial treatment or intervention period, then the second A as the withdrawal period, and then the second B as the second intervention. And again, that could be an additional amount of sort of dose of an intervention. For the pharmacological sort of approach, that might be a literal change in dose. It could also be that you add more sessions. You could add additional activities to the intervention that was happening in the first B section. And then the bottom case in this example of ABAB is that there's no reversal of what's happening, but you do get to see additional sort of periods of time. Another piece here that can be really useful in practice is client monitoring, where you may not have that baseline information, but you may be able to start with the intervention period and then consider this withdrawal or washout. So rather than having a baseline before the intervention, you may have the intervention and then be able to combine that with a withdrawal period where you are able to build that in. So single subject designs with group interventions, you could use this at multiple levels. As I mentioned at the beginning, this doesn't need to be individuals. It could potentially be at a family unit, at a group unit, at a classroom unit, where the unit of observation is then the average of all the students in the classroom, or potentially within a group setting, that there are multiple participants in your group within the agency. So there are really some wider varieties rather than just the idea of a single subject. Single subject designs have really important implications for evidence-based practice. And one of them is that this focus on single subjects does limit the external validity. And there were some ways to think about, um, even though the goal may not have been generalizability, but could you replicate that exact single subject design with other cases? Could you repeat that whole experiment in a different setting, which would be a systematic replication, and then a clinical replication, which would be combining those different interventions into a clinical package to treat multiple problems. So if you had an intervention period that had multiple phases or pieces of that, what that intervention looked like, you may think about ways to replicate that clinical package in a different setting. And then lastly, there's some need to focus on single subjects design in what Engel and Schutt refer to as a diverse society. So part of that would be that single subject designs, because of their ease of implementation, because of their ability to center clients' expectations and needs in terms of the dependent variable, it may be that these are more user friendly and sort of acceptable with clients to evaluate progress, particularly for clients who have been historically underrepresented in research, where there are rare rare phenomenon where you don't have the access to a control group, but particularly this idea of people who have been systematically excluded or mistreated in medical research in terms of randomized control trial types of designs. This single subject approach may be something that is where you're able to offer and use this as a therapeutic device in order to both develop research information and material, but also work with your client and to serve multiple aims of increasing representation in research, but also providing client feedback of how successful the treatment and interventions are. And then lastly, there are really particular and important ethical issues in terms of single subject design. Confidentiality becomes really critical. There's a big potential for breach of confidentiality or being able to identify the participant when there is a single subject. So really, it becomes really important to consider things like informed consent, continual checking in with the client during that consent process so that it isn't just a transaction of consent so much as coming back to the client before reporting these results, potentially getting some additional buy-in. And also that not all IRBs really know about single subject design, and so being able to work with your IRB, if you're tending to work in a setting where single subject designs are less frequently used, to educate and work with your IRB about the relevance of these designs and how best to support both the research aims and also to protect your clients and participants. Another extension of this kind of model is to have concurrent multiple baseline designs, essentially where you have 3 different clients or potentially more clients, though it tends not to have too many more clients, where you have different levels or different extents of that baseline period. So some have shorter, some have longer baseline periods, and what that helps you to understand is to evaluate what would that baseline period might have looked like had it been longer than what you were able to observe.